I hated The Batman.
What?
The positively reviewed, fan beloved, box office success from 2022. That one. The one that gave a lifeline to DC and Warner Brothers and reimagined a former global star in a new suit. I never intended to hate it. Matter of fact, I wanted to love it. But something funny had happened to me over the years, and it came to an uncomfortable boiling point on an October night. The story starts quite a while back, almost a decade and a half ago in 2008. That year had been an important year for me and my relationship with movie watching because it's when I started to consciously make time for film. I think we all have a moment where we grow from watching movies in bits and pieces in the living room with our family to seeking them out on our own. I ended up going to the theaters a whole bunch of times that year, watching films like Yes Man, 7 Pounds, Gran Torino, and The Love Guru. If I had pocket money and a few friends that were available, I was basically at the theaters regardless of what was playing. Those experiences were great. Not only did they give us something to do as a friend group, but they allowed us to delve into the film space head first. And I'd make a day of it. I'd connect with my friends, head to the theater and enjoy what was playing, make my way home and watch some reviews and reactions, and then look at what was coming up next week. It was an incredibly fun time. But not all movies are created the same, are they? No, especially not one in particular that came out in the summer of 2008. I remember going to see The Dark Knight in theaters with the chief editor of this channel, shout out to the boy Chris, on a Saturday night. I headed into that movie pretty excited. The poster art and trailers had been spot on leading up to it, and I wasn't chronically online enough at that age to care about who was cast as the Joker. I just thought that dude looked unhinged and could make for a fun villain. I also didn't know who Chris Nolan was and had not seen any of his films at that point bar Batman Begins in bits and pieces. So expectations were pretty low, and all I really wanted was a good time. What ended up happening was way more than I could have expected. I left the theater that night completely baffled, amazed, and in awe. I wasn't a Batman fan before this, and as I said, I didn't know who Chris Nolan was. But that changed over the course of the 2 hours and 30 minutes of that film. For the first time, I wanted to rewatch a movie right then and there on the spot. I remember gushing about it all the way home, spending the rest of the night surfing the high seas for any copy of it online just to give it another watch that day. I would end up spending the coming weeks on YouTube watching the hackiest impressions of the Joker and thinking, yes, this is cinema. I devoured all the reviews, all the articles, all the interviews. There wasn't a single piece of Dark Knight adjacent media that I left unwatched or unread. This had become, kind of without me knowing at the time, my movie. What helped cement the movie in my mind as incredible was also the critical response. At that time, the relationship between critics and moviegoers was different from what it is today. Critics' scores had a bigger significance on the perception of a film, and to see an 82 on the site for The Dark Knight was exciting. I felt vindicated that my movie was universally getting praised. I was a bit of a Metacritic merchant back then too, often using those scores as guides to judge movies ahead of time or to double down on thoughts I may have had about a feature. In retrospect, it was a shitty practice that required quite a bit of retooling over the years, but that's a convo for another time. It also helped that the online community went bonkers for The Dark Knight. Comic book fans across the board were in love, and the praise reached a fever pitch when Heath Ledger posthumously, and rightfully so, won that Oscar in 2009. It seemed to be a special movie in so many ways, bringing together fans of the genre, fans of film, and new fans like myself into the fold. I spent the next decade and change rewatching The Dark Knight over and over, both at home and on the occasional re-release in theaters. Anytime I found its way onto TNT and I had nothing else to watch, its incredible score and very Nolan-y dialogue played as background noise to my phone scrolling or lounging. In addition to all of this was the growing perception and presence that Chris Nolan had in the industry and my own personal field of view. Along with The Dark Knight becoming my movie, he soon became my director as well. Interestingly, his continued success seemed to retroactively affirm the greatness of The Dark Knight for me. I for sure prescribed some of the creativity from his other films like Interstellar and Inception to The Dark Knight and carried them over into all his other previous works. I mean, it's funny how we do that sometimes. Our perceptions of a film are inextricably linked to where that work sits on a director's shelf, particularly if we are so in tune with that director. This is all to say that in my mind, The Dark Knight was king. I said so, my friends said so, critics said so, and the film's director was at the top of his game for well over a decade. That title of Best Superhero Film would receive few challengers in the years after. The only real exception was the much beloved but smaller scope Logan, and the few Avengers movie that closed out the Infinity Saga, but while they were super fun, they didn't hit the same heights for me as The Dark Knight did. Interestingly, also for those 10 years, Bale's Batman as a character really had no competition. I hadn't fully engaged with the older Batmans, and general consensus seemed to be riding high with Bale as the Batman during my formative years. So when a new Batman was finally set to challenge The Dark Knight, the DCEU was in shambles. Ben Affleck got lost in the mix and it was hard to make sense of it all. Zack Snyder tried to do some unique things with the iteration, but it didn't resonate. I mean, how could it? It didn't even have a standalone movie. The collapse of the DCEU confirmed that, bar its few fans, the Affleck Batman would mostly be an afterthought. So from 2008 to 2022, The Dark Knight reigned supreme and was consistently referenced as the bar by which superhero movies were to be compared to. While other Batman films were great, even other ones by Chris Nolan himself, none seemed to be within touching distance of TDK. Then, in 2019, The Batman was announced. Right away, I was intrigued. With all my rejections of whatever the DCEU was, a standalone Batman film felt fresh and exciting. Add on to that intrigue was the casting of Robert Pattinson in the titular role. I'd come to appreciate Pattinson's talent after watching him in small indie roles like The Lighthouse, Good Time, and The Twilight Saga: Breaking Dawn Part 2. Pattinson was joined by the likes of Paul Dano, Zoe Kravitz, and Colin Farrell. That cast list, as it became more public over time, came to sound more like the list of nominees at the upcoming Academy Awards, as opposed to the actors that were meant to inhabit Gotham. Add to that the incredible trailers, super punchy score, and the decision to throw all these elements into a rain-soaked Gotham during Halloween, and well, you've basically created the perfect Batman cocktail for the fans. The week of the release of the film saw the lifting of the review embargo as fan reactions poured in from early screenings. Critics praised Pattinson, the directing and cinematography, along with the Titanic ensemble, where it seemed like everyone showed up to earn their paycheck. My Twitter feed began to be flooded with thread after thread about how this film was more than they expected, that it was more comically faithful of all the versions of the beloved hero, that this was the best version of Gotham, the best version of Batman, and for some, that this was the best Batman movie. Well, I thought, I guess it's a good movie then. Thursday night turned into a Friday night, turned into a Saturday night, the night I was supposed to go see this. More commentary began dropping, specifically comparing the Batman to The Dark Knight. Points were made about how the new Bruce was more fleshed out, a better, more realistic interpretation of a young Batman. And obviously, the Penguin was heralded and Colin Farrell's performance was beloved across fans and critics. And Catwoman, well, I think it was culturally decided at that moment that the Catwoman iterations went from Michelle Pfeiffer to Zoe Kravitz and maybe some Halle Berry in between. Still, shout out Anne Hathaway, we still love you, but I don't think it's for Catwoman anymore. But most importantly, the new Batman was portrayed as someone aware of his restrictions and limitations because of the grander systems at play. Something that the Bruce of The Dark Knight either disregarded or the film failed to adequately mention. To put it simply, as all the memes have done so, this new iteration of Batman saw that beating up low-level thugs wasn't going to bring about the change he so desired in Gotham. Whereas in The Dark Knight, well, that Batman enjoyed dropping a guy or two for wearing hockey pads. So, with all this, on Saturday night, I made my way to the theater, feeling some kind of way, even before the opening scene had played out in front of me. I was heading to watch a film that was being mentioned as a potential challenger to my favorite film. I was heading to watch a film that was being mentioned as usurping the proverbial Batman throne. What happened from that moment on was some of the most sour shit I've possibly ever done in my life. From the start of the movie, I was nitpicking like it was a personal CinemaSins watch. Something in the Way by Nirvana, cringe as all hell. Bruce being broody and quiet, corny as all hell. The Riddler might as well have slapped a new coat on Heath Ledger's Joker. And the 3-hour runtime, oh brother, does someone think they're important? That last one is particularly funny because it comes from a guy who sought out The Irishman in theaters during its 3-week limited run, a film that creeps up basically on 4 hours. But anyway, these thoughts came and went during the movie, but they were consistent enough that I basically ended up not having a good time. Despite objectively amazing aspects to the film, I left the theater conflicted and weirdly let down. Critics and fans were raving, and I couldn't pinpoint why I felt so disconnected. After the initial bubbling of dissatisfaction went away and I steered clear of the topic on socials, I tried to sit with the film and think about it as objectively as I could to make sense of what I was missing. Was I misunderstanding it or myself? I kept thinking about the movie and why it didn't work for me. As I said, it wasn't a bad film, not by any stretch. The cinematography was on point, the performances were character defining, and Gotham felt grittier and more lived in than I'd ever seen on screen. And yet, it still wasn't clicking. I looked at my issues with the movie closely, only to realize that my, quote, issues were quite subjective, but subjective in a very, very particular way. Take, for example, the issue I supposedly had with the Riddler for being too similar to the Joker. The issue I had only really existed because of the starting point that I made for myself. I didn't really give the character his own breathing room, and instead I spent the majority of the time categorizing each piece of him, each action he took, each line he dropped into buckets of similar or different to the Joker. This constant going back to The Dark Knight in order to assess a movie that had nothing to do with it was really weird in retrospect, though I didn't really see it as wrong at the time. Comparisons and lists and this is better than that are very human things to engage in, but doing it in real time as I was exploring this new piece of work probably was not the right thing to do. Surely you can criticize the character, but it shouldn't only be in the narrow field of comparison. It's like when you go on vacation with some people and all they talk about is how bad the new place is because it's not like home. Yes, my brother, that's the point. We're going on vacation to not be home, to not have that old experience. But for me, I was caught in that loop when I was watching this. The more I thought about it, it slowly came to uncover that in reality, I wasn't actively working with what was in front of me. Instead, I was actually watching the Batman through 3 different filters or angles. The first was this defensive state of protecting something that I loved and cherished from my past and did not want to see a challenge in the present. I didn't want the internal conversation of, is this film better than The Dark Knight? I mean, I'd spent so much time holding up The Dark Knight as this perfect Batman film that I wasn't really open to the idea of something else taking its place or even standing alongside it. That's why I walked into the theater already prepared to nitpick that day, to find flaws, and to compare it to something that had been absolutely mythologized in my mind and frankly in our culture. The second angle was kind of driven by the first one in that I took all the positive praise that the movie had received from the media, from my socials, and from my friends and cranked it up to 11 so that when I went into the theater, the expectations that I had put on it were so incredibly and unfairly high that it had to fail. And in doing so, it would make it easier for me to say, well, this just wasn't really all that good as everybody was saying. And of course, this was kind of because I was engaging in all the algos and shit on socials, where I was constantly seeing pro-Pattinson, pro-Reeves, anti-Bale, anti-Nolan content, and was engaging with it nonstop. That's your 2020s for you nowadays. Looking back on it, it's funny how much my emotional attachment warped my expectations. The fact is, we carry the baggage of our previous experiences into new ones, sometimes unconsciously, and it absolutely skews how we see things. I should have used the feedback from my friends and from critics and, the online community to become excited for the movie, to look for those things and, enjoy them. As opposed to that, I used that as a stick to beat the movie with. But the third angle that kind of saved me a little bit is that ultimately, I just wanted a good movie. I mean, that's why I was going to the theaters. To watch films, to enjoy them, and have conversations about them. That's where this all started. Back in 2008. And that's why I think, thankfully I had the patience to give this a thought or two before moving on. This retrospective third angle allowed me to come to the conclusion that I obviously wasn't mad at The Batman for being a bad film, because it absolutely wasn't. I was mad at it for attempting to replace my favorite film. While others looked on and cheered, I couldn't help but think we were moving on too quick. And obviously no one really was saying this, but it was all happening internally for me. Ultimately though, this is all okay. The Batman wasn't supposed to replace The Dark Knight, either out in the culture or in my head. It was supposed to be its own thing, and I put upon it this incredibly impossible task of entertaining me, carrying on a legacy of a personal landmark film, and on top of that, doing so without making me feel like it was competing with it. That's absolutely impossible, right? That's why I'm going to the movies to watch The Batman. I forgot that I go to the theaters to watch something new and sometimes be challenged. Because otherwise, I can just stay home and watch The Dark Knight on a loop and watch the same characters and the same director and hear those same lines and cheer at the same moments. So after that initial watch, I gave it a bit of time and distance. I wanted to reset my expectations and try again. And so a few months later, during a 4K sale on Amazon, I bought the film and watched it with fresh eyes. And you know what? I really, really enjoyed it. It's a dark, atmospheric, brooding movie and has such a unique take on the character, and it's so well grounded in the current time that we're in. Pattinson nails the tortured, reclusive side of Bruce, and the Riddler is genuinely unsettling for large stretches of the film. It's a different flavor of Batman, and while it doesn't replace The Dark Knight for me, like I weirdly didn't want to, it no longer has to. No film is ever going to really replace The Dark Knight for me, because I'm never going to be that age again, be so open and permeable to new ideas on the big screen. That was a high that I probably will never reach again. Instead, I should look to give up this attempt to compare and argue if it's going to replace it or if it's the best, and just enjoy the thing for what it is. The Batman does what a new iteration of a beloved character should do. It reimagines, reinterprets, and offers something fresh while staying true to the core of the universe. And in the end, not only did it give me a film that I thoroughly enjoy, it also taught me something important about myself as a moviegoer, about what am I bringing to that experience, and is there anything I should maybe check at the door before I step in. So yeah, I hated The Batman at first, and for a few months after that, I would say. But now I can appreciate it for what it is, a really solid, well-crafted film that stands on its own and is now part of my Halloween rotation. I'm super excited for the sequel, and I'm letting all the Penguin episodes build up for a Halloween marathon later this month. I can't wait to see what Matt Reeves does, and I honestly hope that the sequel impacts me in my adult years in the same way that The Dark Knight did my adolescence. Obviously, it can't achieve that, but maybe it can try. This was Storytime with Admir. Thank you for watching.